Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be digging into a way to build a quiz-based framework for engagement with an audience. This is something we mentioned doing in last season, and it's just taken us a while to sort of put the mechanics in place to do this. But this is going to be a show that we cover this over multiple episodes. So in this first show, we're going to focus on how you would take a response from an audience and then display that. And then we'll start to build everything out around that. But before we get into that, as always, I welcome everyone. If you have any comments, have any feedback, please just post them in the comments, and we'll try to answer everything right here on air, or at least in the post show. Also, if you'd like to join us live on air, we do have a link that you can go to. It's in the show notes for here, and somebody from the studio can get you on, and you can join us live on air. So let's get started. First, I want to say hi to a couple of people who have joined us. So we have Battle for Freedom. Glad to see you here. Not quite working on a Linux server, but hopefully, since this is Node.js, that it should work on Linux as well as Windows or Mac. So thank you for joining us. I also have a Photo Mentor on. So thank you very much, Lee. This Photo Mentor is Lee Love. He has a great show that he does where they really talk about photography, but more than anything else, they talk about art and sort of the creation of art, seeing value, seeing uniqueness in things and capturing that. So great show if you get a chance to watch it. We also have Bill Mew. Bill, thank you for joining us from Tunbridge. And he said thanks for answering his queries from last week's show. More than happy to do that. Thank you for the engagement around that. Bill and I had a conversation around different ways that you could manage the list of guests that you were going to have for a show as opposed to hard coding them. So we went back and forth on that. And that can be something we can jump into if there's broader interest in the post show. So let me talk a little bit about the model that we're going to use for this quiz framework. So the way we want this to operate is that we want any user, any viewer, to be able to respond in the comments from whatever platform they're on. So that can be YouTube, it can be Facebook. If there's something we can capture as a comment, then we want to let them comment on that. And so the model we're using is that this will be a multiple choice type of quiz process. And you'll get the ability to say, for this question, do you want to answer A, B, C, or D? And with that framework, what we want is people to be able to go #A or #C in the comments, and we will pull that in and store that information associated with that user as their response, with that viewer as their response. And from there, we can sort of move into processing that and doing other things. But that's the basic goal, is that in showing a question, you can get people in comments to respond. So what do we have to do to make that happen? So when we pull that comment in, we will need to validate it. So if people said #lemons, obviously that's not an answer. So we have to sort of do that first level validation to make sure we have the right answer. And if we do, then we have to store that. And we have to store that with some sort of unique identifier, because we don't want as users to keep changing answers. I mean, you could do that and you could allow that. But our thinking was once a user answers, then their answer is sort of locked in. And you can go on and look for other answers from other users. So that's really the basic core of what we're doing here. And what we wanted in terms of how this would flow in a show is that when a person does respond, you want it to display their sort of avatar and their name up on the screen. So each person that responds, as they respond, you see, these people's picture and name show up on the screen. And then when you sort of say, we're closing the question, we don't want any more answers, at that point, we can go in and we can populate a second display, which will show, here's everybody that answered question A, everyone for B, C, and D. So this will now let us go sort of from the answering phase to the display the results phase. And so that's what we're going to cover on today's show. This is all in Node.js. So, excuse me. So let's actually look at the output here from vMix. I'm going to start with this so you can get a sense of how this would actually look in practice. So right now, I would just have this sitting here on the screen. And let me turn around and bring up the show responses. So that will be on the screen. Now, all I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up and say, let's get responses in. And now what will happen is everybody that responds will start to show up here and tile in across the screen. Because this is a tricky thing to do with getting a live audience and doing all that together, what we're actually doing is we're driving the answers from another script. So we have just a script that's pulling out all this information. And so that's what we're doing here. But this would just work by pulling in the actual comments that are coming in and displaying everybody this way. When I would have all of these done, what I would do is I would say, okay, let's display how this all broke up. And then I can go and I can sort of show how everybody responded. So this will take that breakup and show you, everybody that responded to A, B, C, and D. So that's how this looks in operation. The aesthetics, this was done as a demo thing, so I would probably do things different if I were to spend more time on the design. But hopefully this will give you an idea of the types of things you can do with this. So let's actually start to dive into the vMix session a little bit so we have a little more on the mechanics of how this script is going to work. So if we look at the vMix UI here, in this case, I have a fairly simple thing because I'm doing this for demonstration purposes. So I have 4 inputs in this. I have the first input, and this is the important thing, because this is how we're getting the information into the program. We're putting up a social media lower third, a social media title in vMix, which is pulling in all the different fields from vMix Social. So anybody that responds in vMix Social, they're showing up here. So let me just sort of click over here so you can see. So you can see I'm just looping in the background, making posts into this input. But this input is going to be what's fed from vMix Social. And you can see, so I have what was their response, and I have their avatar and their name. So this is what we're using to get that information in from the comments. And at that point, we just have 2 other titles that we're using here. One to show guests as they come in, so responders as they come in. So that's what sort of tiled across the screen with with this UI. And then we have a second one, which basically is very similar, except we just sort it differently. We have a different backdrop, and we just sort the same basic information out by how people responded. So that's really how we set this up. So what I'd like to do next is jump in to show when we capture this data, what does this look like? So, and then we can get into the actual code itself. So let me go over here and sort of jump in. So if we jump into the Visual Studio Code, basically what we have here is JSON, and we are building this dynamically. So we create an object inside of Node.js, which we'll talk about. And as people respond, what I'm doing is saying, what did they respond with? Is it valid? If it's valid, then we start to add in, okay, for that response, #A, who responded that way. And so you can see every time I get somebody else that responds with #A, I just continually grow this object. And that's how I'm doing it. So I do this for A, B, C, and D. And so this is giving us a sort of a core framework for storing this information. So every response gets added to this under the right bucket. And we then use this information, name, avatar URI, and the answer they gave for everything else that we're displaying. So that's all the sort of run up to actually diving into the code. Let me just check on the comments again, and we'll see who else has joined us. So we have Sergio. He says, he says, forget my name in Spanish, always waiting to see your video. So Sergio, thank you very much. We have Kevin Michael Reed. So yeah, thank you. I mean, we were actually, this is something we've been planning for quite a while. And to be honest, the reason it's taken a while to get to it is because we didn't feel we could really do it right in pure vMix scripting. And we wanted to sort of introduce Node.js and do it in that. And it's just, there's a lot of moving parts in this. So, and then we have Joey Otto. Hopefully it could be Otu. So I apologize if I've said that incorrectly, Joey, but we are very happy to have you here. So thank you. Okay, so let's switch over and we'll dig a bit into the code now. So as I said, this is Node.js, so we're doing some of the preliminary stuff. We're loading in the libraries that we're using for, parsing XML into JSON and for working with web calls, because everything that we're going to be doing that is driving from or driven off of vMix is all going to be done through the web interface. So we need to have the fetch and everything we have set there. And now these are, when I talked about the objects that we have, basically this is what we were talking about here. These are our JavaScript objects that we're sort of initializing at the start of the program. And when we do this, we're basically saying, put all the valid answers into this object, put all the people who've responded into this object. So I know if another answer comes in, I can check here to see if this person responded already. So it's a very easy way to do that. And then we just count up the total number of responses. So that's really all we have for the variables and things we're tracking globally. So as I mentioned, we have our own sleep function, which we've gone into before because there isn't an easy way to sleep directly in Node.js. So the first thing we do, and we've done this in every Node show we've done so far, is we get the vMix XML in JSON format. And we've covered this in the past, so I don't want to dive too deeply into it. But basically, we're just fetching all this, and then we convert it from XML, the standard vMix XML, into JSON, and we return that as an object. And everything we have here is basically doing that, or if there's an error, we catch it here. And if vMix hasn't started, we'll keep looping until it's able to bring the vMix stuff in. So stuff we all covered, and then we return that as the parsed JSON. So the other thing I mentioned as we were going through the vMix interface was that we're using a social media title inside of vMix to pull in our responses from the audience. And so this is the function that does that. So we basically start out knowing that when somebody responds, there are 3 pieces of information I'm going to take from them. I'm going to take what their name is, I'm going to take their avatar, basically the URL of their image, and I'm going to take an answer that they type in. So we set this up as the object, and that's what we're going to return. And we go through here, basically pulling the information out of vMix, out of this title in vMix. And so when we come in here, what we're saying is, let's take the JSON in, which is all the vMix XML, and then we're going to say which input in that vMix XML, but now JSON, are we going to be looking at? And that's the first input with the social media title. And at that point, we are just setting up all the strings to get, we pull in the input, and then we get the from name, the from photo, and the message. And so we're doing this here, and then we just go and send it off to vMix to get all these things back. Again, very straightforward stuff that we've done in the past. But this gives us all this in a response, and we go and we take that responder object back. So that's how we actually read stuff. So when we start, though, we need to go and take these titles that now are sort of fully populated in vMix, and we need to clear them out. So what we're doing here now is we go in and we say, what's the, let me say, nope, let's see, do I have this right? Yep, okay. So updater, responder title. So this actually, I'm one step ahead of myself. This is actually where we update. So every time we get a new responder in, this is where we do that update into the title. So we're getting the response data in. We know, which slot the user is going to be in. So we're coming through here and saying, let's go and get the name, the avatar, and the title of this, and the response of the person that came in. And we then turn around and say, now we're putting that into the update, which slot in there. So slot 1, 2, 3, 4, because if you remember, it's sort of tiled across as people responded. So we're saying whatever slot we're up to, we take that, and then we go and we push in the image, the name, and the in the right slot, and then we turn that slot on, because when it starts out, there's nothing there. We have this stuff all set, but we've hidden it. So this is what we do now, and we just put the person's details in, turn the slot on, and we do that as we move across, bringing in each one of the responders into this. So similarly, after we finished doing this with everybody, and we want to display the answers, we're doing something very similar with the answers title, which was the one which has A, B, C, and D, and the people who responded accordingly. And so we're going into this, and we are basically saying, let's get a list of responders A to D. And we are, it's a little more complicated in the code here, but what we're essentially doing is we're pulling in all the response data for each one of these tags. And if you remember when I showed, let me jump over here since we're here. When I showed the XML, you remember everything is sort of, when I showed the JSON, everything is sort of organized by the answer name. So all I'm doing when I do this is I'm creating independent JSON objects, this one with everybody that responded A, B, C, and D. And that's how I have them set up. Response A, B, C, and D are now pulling in all that data. And to simplify how we do stuff, we're looping through the array and saying, okay, let me fill in array A, sort of the line A with all the answers. And that's all we're doing. So these response fields are used as part of our loop. And we're pulling in and saying, that's sort of our outer loop. Let's take, if I'm working on A, fill in the entire row of A. And that's all we're doing here. So we take whatever the current array is, and we take the length. So if 6 people have responded using A, we loop through the inside 6 times and paint their pictures in order. And that's, again, just standard vMix functions for sending that information into the title. And like before, we fill in the information, then we turn on the images for that. So this just gives us an easy way. And so the outer loop is going for A, B, C, and D, and the inner loop is going for each individual that responded to that. But that's all we're doing in this code here. So I know there's sort of a lot of stuff that I'm going through quickly, but I think, we'll post all this and you'll be able to download it, and, it will hopefully make a lot more sense when you have the code sitting in front of you. So this is what I started before. We actually have to initialize these titles before we get going, because we had stuff going into them before. So what we're doing here is we basically go in and we loop through everything and turn off, basically, if you say set image visible off, which is what we have right here. So all we're doing is we're taking all of the inputs that we have sort of specified and all of the framework around that, and we're just turning them off so they're not visible in the title. And this is stuff we've done in standard vMix scripting. We're just doing it here, and we just create the URL we need, and then we do a fetch on that URL, and it executes that command in vMix. So very simple as a concept. And so we're just doing this in the beginning, clear out all of the answers, clear out all of the responded guests. And so we do that first. This is for, I think these are all the people that have responded. And then we follow that up and we do the same thing for how we displayed the answers. So in doing this now, between these two areas, we've created a blank slate to work with. And let me keep going, because the interesting part, is really at the end with how the main loop works, and that we'll spend a little more time with. So the other thing that we said is when somebody responds, we need to validate that response before we add it, and that's what this function here does, is valid answer. So we're coming in, we're taking the response, and we're looking and basically saying, what are the potential good responses that somebody can make? And this is some of the great stuff you can do when you're working with JSON. We basically go there and say, if the answer that this person gave doesn't have an index in this good responses array, it's not a good answer. So it's a very easy thing. We basically get to say, okay, if the answer isn't 0, 1, 2, 3, or whatever, if it's -1, which means it wasn't there, that answer isn't in the list of good answers. So it's a very easy way to do the validation, but this is going to make it easy to change what we want. So if you can see here, I added an E. You could actually add other answers. You could put in things that are specific to a question. So, you could replace this and make this all dynamic and pull that when you post a question, which will be what we'll do in a future show, for managing questions. But this gives you a very simple way to do that type of validation. And, we will log an error if the response was not in the list. So, whoever's running this will know we had an invalid response. So now we're getting into some of the more interesting stuff that we're doing to control all of this, sort of the actual flow of how this works. What we're going to do is we're going to use the dynamic values inside of vMix to control the flow of our main loop, to say, what is it doing? Is it accepting responses? Is it displaying answers? Anything in there, that's going to be how we're going to control it with dynamic values. So we needed a function that does that. So really very simple. We just have we take the JSON object, which is sort of what we have with the latest vMix XML, and we create a JSON object with the dynamic values of value 1 to 4, which is all there. And then we are just using xpath.find, which is a function that we loaded from the libraries at the beginning, to take and say, in this JSON we have back from the vMix state, give me dynamic values 1 to 4. And so we pull that out and return this as an object, which means that when we receive that, we can take whatever we assign that to and go, that name dot value 1 dot value 2. Then we have those dynamic values available to us all the time. So again, just driving off the same concepts in vMix using the different framework to do it. So we also want to be able to set dynamic values from the Node.js application here, because there are times where we want to turn around and say, okay, something happened, so we're going to change state ourselves and sort of say, okay, we want to lead to the next function. And so we need to be able to set that because we're using these dynamic values as a control. And again, very simple thing, just a execution of a vMix web API to set the value to whatever value you want to set, to set the dynamic value to whatever value you want to put in it. And so we have which vMix session, which dynamic value to update, and what's the value. So the next thing we're doing is, if we have a good value and we want to add it to that JSON object with all the valid responses, here's the function we call. So in this, we first check and say, if you've called this function, make sure that nothing you sent in was null, that everything was good. So if something is null, it means we didn't find it and we just return and say it's false. That's not it. We can't add it. If we have a good response, if we have a response, we got to make sure it's a good response. So we check that, and that was the is valid answer, which is a function we covered before. And if it is valid, then what we're going to do is we're going to say these responders, we're going to create a list of everybody that responded. We're going to just add them to that responder list. And the way we do that is we use the URI, the URL of their image, because we know that's a unique value. So it key to creating an index like this is that for each individual person that responds, we now have a unique value we can associate with them. So when we set this up, we're basically saying, let's go in, and if this person hasn't responded, so it's saying if this object if this user has already responded, we don't want to take another response from this. That's what I mentioned before, where we're blocking that. That's how we're doing it. We're saying if the person responding now has the same image URL as somebody who responded before, then we want to block that. And if they don't, which means it's a good answer, valid answer, the data's there, and they didn't respond before, then we just go and we add these people into both the user object to say they've responded, but also we're now storing this around the user responses. So if you remember, we organized the JSON around hash A, B, C, and D, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So we say the responses object for this key, which is the answer they gave, let's push the user response object, the whole object onto there. So we're just adding these things to our JSON store inside of memory. So very fast and efficient for doing this. So that's all the support functions. Now let's dive into the main loop where we pull this together. So inside the main loop, we're doing a few things. So we do all the initialization, everything we set out. So the first thing we do is we say, let's clear the two responded title and the answers title, which we talked about up there. So we do that in the beginning. And then we go into this main processing loop, which is running in the background all the time. And so we just say while true, and it's just sitting there. So what we have to do on each iteration of the loop is we load the latest vMix state, because vMix can be changing dynamically. So we load all of that, and we get the dynamic values that are associated with the current state. And we use dynamic value 1 to say, what do we want to do now in this main loop? So if dynamic value 1 is set to 1, this means that we want to actually now start collecting people who are responding. And so as we go and we check, all we're doing here is saying, while this is set to 1, while dynamic value 1 is set to 1, we are now just going to keep looping through and looking for new people who responded. And that's what we're doing here. So we're reading the title with the, passing the vMix JSON for title 1, and we're getting the user response answers. And then we're turning around and doing all the stuff. We add, we do the add response, which does all the checks to make sure it's a new answer, blah, blah, blah. And, we say, okay, did this return true or false? If it returned false, then we'll just sleep for a second and continue. But if it returned true, we'll update the total number of valid responses, because we need to know that. And then we're just going to say, go back and, update, everything that we have for the responders now. So that means we can put another guest into this new guest can now get added to our responders title. All the functionalities here, but now the logic becomes clearer because we push all those things into functions. And that's one of the major differences between vMix scripting and Node.js. I can create functions, and then my main path of logic becomes much simpler to manage. So all I'm doing now is, it's a good thing, so we just add them to the title, add them to the people who've responded. And that's, so that's it. When it's set to 1, that's what it's going to do. When we set it to 2, that's basically saying, now we want to shut down new responses, and we want to show you, sort of aggregate the responses we've collected already. And that's, again, all we've done very simply. It's, we change the value to 2, and we say, update the answers title. This is taking all the data that was organized by answer, and now we painted that out into the 4 rows. And once we do that, because we've painted it out, we actually go and we set dynamic value to 0, which we consider a sort of our idle loop value. So when you set to 0, you're basically telling this loop, well, just loop, but don't do anything until that value changes. So it goes in and says, okay, I'm just going to hold here until I have something else that I need to do. And so that's all we've added right now. But I think you can see from the structure here that it's very easy now for me to add things like put in new questions. So if I want to go and add another question, I can come back and say, okay, I can just make that another value, and there'll be a group of logic that I use around displaying the questions and like going to the next question and doing all these other things. So with this framework in place, I now have the ability to flesh this out into a full quiz type application where you can have questions, tally results, aggregate the results over multiple questions. So these are all things we're going to do in future shows. But this is the core framework. And the way we do this now, and what's really cool, is that I can use just like a Stream Deck here with hotkeys to say, I want to show a question. I want to display open it up for responses. I want to open it up to display. I want to now close the questions and display what everybody has responded and add new things like next question and everything else. So it means that even though I have all this running in the background, I can control it all right from vMix in my session with other things that I'm doing. And I think that's an important component to this. Operationally, this is something that a vMix operator can do, even though this other stuff is running in the background. All right, so I think we sort of covered a lot in this show so far. So what I'd probably like to do, we'll jump into our post-show hangout, and we can dig a little deeper into anything we've talked about here. I'm happy to go into more detail. And we will be following this up. Probably our next show will focus on adding questions into this. And then we'll probably have a third show after that, which sort of wraps this all together for doing it over a whole session. But we think that that will probably be the flow of what we're going to do show-wise. And it's all going to be built off of this core framework that I just went through here. So if you can hang out, I'd love to have you join us for the post-show. If not, we will be back next week with another show on this. So I would love to see all of you. So we'll call it a wrap for the show. See you in the post-show, or I'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to the post-show. So this was something that we have been working on for quite a while. And so Bill, thank you. Yeah, we were pretty excited about this. So Bill's asking, can you show how you'd run it from vMix? Absolutely. So let me actually sort of jump in, and maybe if we can show the Stream Deck here. I don't know if we have a good shot for this here, but if we can show how I have the Stream Deck set up. I have just a set of shortcut keys. So let me sort of get this around so you can take a look. So all I have here is I have these 4 buttons across the bottom, which set the dynamic value 1 to different values. So when it says set idle, it's setting it to 0. I don't have anything for set the question. Set response is setting it to 1. Set to display the results of the responses is set to 2. And so when we press this button, we just have a shortcut in vMix that is going in and changing dynamic value 1. And then if I switch over to the code we did here in the main loop, where I have this here is this loop, which is basically up here that says while true. This is just constantly running. And so what it's doing when it starts is it's getting the dynamic value. So it's reading the value. It's going to know what key I press because I set that in a dynamic value. And then based on what's in value 1, so it's looking up here and saying, is dynamic value 1 set to 1? If it is, then it's having this piece of code run, which is collecting responses from people. If it's equal to 2, then it comes down here and it's having this piece of code run right down here because this is all everything associated with 2. And with the idle, when I set it to 0, since nothing is here, this loop is basically going in and saying, is it 1? Nope, don't do anything. Is it 2? Nope, don't do anything. Then it just goes back to the top and loops again. So this is how, from vMix, I can then just take that and control it, even though this is running on a totally different system. And what's really cool is you could actually have this running offset in the production. You don't need to interact with this. Once this is up and running, it will just do its thing, and then you are controlling every step of it through the dynamic values. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense, but it is really just straightforward dynamic values that are being used to control everything. And so we use that to adjust the logic flow in this. So it's definitely a pretty cool way to decouple the systems, but still make it operate and controllable from the main vMix system. And I mean, the other thing is, because this is just running with URLs, you could run this on multiple vMix systems. So you could actually be reading the dynamic values from a production system that you're actually switching a show on, and actually updating all of the titles or anything else you want to display on a second vMix system that you're just doing pre-multiplied alpha out of to do as overlays on your first. So lots of possibilities when you start to get into using these as functions that have calls, because all we did here is we have the vMix, the URL of vMix, sort of, in this case, localhost, :8088/API. That is the URL for this system, but that could easily be another URL. And so when I call each of these functions, like to update titles or to get information, I am actually passing what vMix JSON stack am I working with. So I can collect 2 stacks from 2 different vMix systems, pull them in and work with both of them independently. So a lot of flexibility here. So that was something that we think is, it gives us the chance to do a lot more with this general framework for other things we'd like to do, even beyond quizzes. So hopefully that helped. So John is saying, amazing, I may be speechless. John, for a Toastmaster to be speechless is not a good thing. So, but I definitely appreciate this. This was a lot of fun to actually do. And as I said, I think this will be the basis for a lot of different things we want to do going forward, code-wise. So we're going to sort of keep this as a foundation and grow from there. But one of the things that you saw me, add in here with some very general things to like get and set values out of vMix from the dynamic values. I can go and take lots of different things and code them one time and basically build a library of things for dynamic values, things for finding inputs, things for changing things inside of titles, and start to encapsulate this so that when I code in the future, that stuff's just there. And then all I'm really doing is saying, give me the first input with this name, and I can just get that back. So I can create my own library of functions that I don't have to keep reinventing, and use that as I go forward. So Bill, it's an interesting question, because I sort of did this as a general way to handle responses. He's saying, how quickly will you run out of space on the screen to show all the respondents for all or any one question? So what I did is I set this up where I have 22 slots for people to respond. So there, for most people, that would be a pretty good response if it were being done as sort of a general show. But this could certainly expand to many, many more. If you think about when I gave the answer screen, I shrunk everybody down and made them all smaller. So, that title has less, it takes up less space per respondent on there. So you could shrink it. The other possibility is you could do something a little more arty, where you sort of can be popping up people that are sort of as they respond, they go into a big slot, and then sort of move them to smaller slots and rotate people in and out. So you could sort of turn around and say, I'll have like a background slot where everybody's just sort of rotating. When I reach the end, I go back to the beginning, and I just have the most current person that answered displayed in the middle for a period of time, and then they go in. So there could be different ways to handle this if you're expecting a massive number of respondents. It may also be something that you'd want to do differently if you were doing something in a classroom style setting, where it may be that you don't necessarily want to display everybody when they come in, but you may do something where you just turn around and say, as everybody answers, I will, just pop them up and then take them off. And when the next person answers, I just show them one at a time. And then for the answers, you could turn around and say, I'll just have a screen that shows everybody that got the question correct. And maybe that would be a smaller subset or something more manageable. Or again, it could be something where you just flash through a list, turn around and say, okay, I'll just sort of have different size images. And so the person that I'm talking about now will be sort of in that bigger center image and two side images. And then you just keep circulating. So I say, now I move this person to there to the smaller image and take the next person, bring it. Different dynamic ways to do it too, visually dynamic ways to do it. So yeah, and so, the same thing, with, as I said, with the rows, you don't have to do it this way. This is just done. So in each of these rows, I think I have 12 slots in there for each answer. And again, I know that wasn't probably something that would work in real world, but this was just a title for demonstration purposes. So let's see. So yeah, so in the, so let's see. Let me I just want to touch on one more thing for Bill, because he's asking about the amount of people that can be shown in a row, and that's the point. Okay, so I did cover that. That's the point where you may have to show this differently if you're expecting large numbers of responders for this. But that's probably doing something more dynamic would be the way. So let me jump back. So we have Battle for Freedom is saying, what camera lens are we using to broadcast? So this lens here, I'm trying to remember. This is an Olympus 14 millimeter, and it's a the 4/3 micro 4/3 system. So that's going to be like a 28 or something in a full frame equivalent. So yeah, it's a 14 millimeter micro 4/3 fixed prime lens, and I think it's f1.7. So that's what you have there. But we do have other cameras here. So like I have a variable lens over here, so I can go from 12 to 60, and I also have a couple of Sigma lenses for 16 millimeter and 30 millimeter that we use for other shots and other things we've done. But so there are selection lenses, but the one you're looking at right now is an Olympus. All right, so let's see. So Battle for Freedom is saying if you should go with a 50 millimeter or 85 millimeter, because it never feels like my camera shot is right. Okay, so that's there's lots of different things in setting up a lens, and so sort of the two main ones when you consider like framing your shot is how far away are you from the background, and how far is the camera away from you, because you do have, when we talk about depth of field, what we're really talking about is how big an area would be considered reasonably in focus. There's one focal plane, which is, this is absolutely in focus, but these are acceptable focus on each side before it starts to get out of focus and blur. So when you're further away from somebody and you focus in, you create a shallower depth of field. So, doing something like, since you're also micro 4/3 with the Lumix, if you're doing a 50 or 85, a 50 millimeter is a pretty, deep lens. Because now you're talking 100 millimeter full frame lens, and that's going to mean that the camera is pretty far away. Now that will help. in some ways, because that means that you will get a shallower depth of field if your camera's further away and you have, it could help blur, what's behind you a bit when you're in focus. So you get some advantages there, but it really depends on how you'd lay out your space and where your lighting is, and so because you also are dealing with field of view, so you want to make sure when you're in this, you have the width that you want and that you capture everything. Like you can see, I'm really like half the width of the screen, and so my goal when we set this up was that we could do this sort of half box shot, and I would still fit in without being cramped. But I could pull this in and have a much tighter shot if that's what you want. So really a difficult thing to answer in the abstract. But what might be helpful is if you have somebody with a variable lens, even if it doesn't give you the true look you want, if you took and you set that to different focal lengths and then sort of move the camera around with that, that should give you a pretty good idea of where you want to be. And you're going to get the best bang for the buck with a prime lens typically, and you're also going to get a better f-stop. So a better aperture. So I think like this is 1.7 as a prime. My sigmas are 1.4s. So again, that will give you that nice shallow depth of field. But you can see, like if I put my hand out, you see my hand just from this lens is out of focus when it's out there. So I don't get into focus again until I'm just about here, which is not that far from my face. So it also depends on how comfortable you are sort of keeping in a box when you're up too, because that's another thing to keep in mind. So okay, hopefully that covered everything. So you're welcome. Battle for Freedom. Thank you. So if we have any other questions, let's get them in now. Otherwise, we will wrap up. A quick peek for our next show. What I want to do on the next show is fill in sort of the first part of this, which would be how do you read in a list of questions that you want to use in the show and walk through those questions one at a time and get responses. So one of the important things to keep in mind with this is that because we're using vMix Social, when you move between multiple questions, you will need to flush out everything that's in vMix Social's queue in vMix Social and then start over again, because all those vMix Social tends to work just through a rotation. It takes like the last, I think by default it's the last 200 responses, and it will rotate through those. And that's how we collect everybody, because if we miss somebody on one, we pick them up on the next. So we're looping through as vMix Social loops through. So this is going to give us this will give us the ability to pull to make sure we capture all the answers. But it also means that you have to flush out that queue between questions. Otherwise, you'll be seeing old answers as new ones. So just a little heads up on how that would have to work. But that would be the next phase to this, is pulling in that first question and making sure that you could step through those questions, and you'll just have to flush out the queue in between. But that's what we'll be covering on the next show. And again, all controllable through dynamic value 1. That's how we'll be working everything here. Okay, so Battle for Freedom is saying he likes that his camera is about 2 feet from him, and the wall is 4 to 6 feet behind. And he's a 14 millimeter 1.7. So the 14 millimeter 1.7. Right now our camera is probably about 3.5, 4 feet in front of me. I have a monitor that uses the confidence monitor, and the camera's sitting right on top of that. So it's about 4 feet, and I have about 6-ish feet between myself and the wall. And you can see that the wall isn't like totally blurred, but it's softened. And that was the look that we were looking for, is to take that backdrop, which had some stuff going on in it, and just sort of let it fade a little bit more, become less soft and less hard edges. And we thought that would create that good separation we were looking for. So it may be something there. I think, with the space you have, the 14 millimeter is a good choice, because it works well in these sort of tighter spaces. but a lot of options there visually, and just sort of shifting, move the desk back a little, move the camera away a little. All those things can make a big difference. So, all right, so let's see. So Joey said, "Oh, well, Joey, thank you. I think I've said this before. YouTube is your friend when it comes to learning this stuff. There are excellent tutorials on JavaScript and Node.js on YouTube. And if this is something that you want to learn, I would suggest sort of go there and say, JavaScript basics, Node.js basics, and search for that on YouTube, and you will get excellent information back to help you get started with this. And as always, we do put all of the things that we show on here up in the GitHub repository, which is also in the show notes. So, pulling that down, playing with it, trying to figure out how to change it, that's always a good way to learn. Because ultimately, the best way to learn is to set a task for yourself and say, I'm going to code this, and then just work through it. And don't be overly ambitious in the beginning. So say, I'm going to do something very simple. I want to just read something off of vMix. And so what do I have to do that? Okay. And then grow from there. Because you'll find that if you do it over and over again, it'll work really well, and you'll start to pick all of this stuff up. I still have a lot to learn. I am not pretending that I'm an expert with any of this, but it's something that I'm enjoying doing, and I'm enjoying sharing it with all of you. So Battle for Freedom, thank you. I really appreciate you making the time to watch. And I got to watch some of the shows you're putting out, and I think they're great. So thank you as well. We need to have sane voices with a generous heart behind them, advocating for things in this world. And thank you for doing that. So, all right, I guess for this week we will call it a wrap. Thank you all for hanging out, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.